Hello everyone. We are continuing with our series titled The I Am Sayings of Jesus. And in this video, we are going to turn our attention to the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 11, where Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. Now, whenever we discuss these I am sayings of Jesus, I'm reminding us of the fact that Jesus uses simple terms, simple words to explain profound truths about himself and also his relationship with us. So in this video, when we focus our attention on Jesus' statement where he says, I am the good shepherd, we are going to divide this video into three parts. In section 1, we are going to talk about the characteristics of the bad shepherds. Characteristics of the bad shepherds. In section 2, we are going to talk about the Pharisees and the Jewish religious leaders who were examples of bad shepherds. And in section 3, we are going to talk about Jesus Christ as the good shepherd and some of the characteristics of this good shepherd. So let's begin with section 1, where we are going to talk about characteristics of the bad shepherds. Now, I want us to know that in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, the Bible uses the word shepherd to speak about any leader that were leading the people of Israel. And therefore, there were spiritual leaders who were called shepherds. There were political leaders who were called shepherds. There were social leaders that were called shepherds, and so on. And in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, we find that there is no shortage of bad shepherds. There is one particular chapter in the Old Testament that I want to turn our attention to. This is the book of Ezekiel, chapter 34, where God is speaking about some of these bad shepherds in the nation of Israel. God is talking about the kings, the priests, and the prophets who were bad shepherds. Ezekiel chapter 34, first verses 1 and 2. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel, prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? So it seems like God is very upset with the shepherds of Israel. And he says, woe to you, O shepherds of Israel. He's speaking to the kings or the kings in the past. He's speaking to the priests and the prophets among them. He says, woe to you, because you take care only of yourselves. You do not take care of the sheep. It is the duty of the shepherd to take care of the sheep. But these shepherds in Israel, who were bad shepherds, were only trying to profit from the sheep. The profit for themselves. They were not trying to take care of the sheep. And look at what verse 3 says. They have done certain things there, which we read, you eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You are supposed to take care of the flock, but you try to only profit from the flock. You eat the curds, you clothe yourselves with the wool, and you slaughter the choice animals. In other words, the shepherds of Israel, the kings, the priests, and the prophets, were not taking care of the people underneath them. They were just trying to make profit out of them. Verse 4 tells us what the shepherds were actually supposed to do, but they did not do. Verse 4, you have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So verse 4 tells us the duties of a shepherd. A shepherd is supposed to strengthen the weak sheep. A shepherd is supposed to heal the sick among his sheep. A shepherd is supposed to bind up the injuries of the sheep. A shepherd is supposed to bring back the stray sheep. He is supposed to search for the lost sheep. None of these have been done by the shepherds of Israel. No wonder God says that I'm angry with you. Woe to you, you shepherds of Israel. Instead, they have shepherded them harshly and brutally. A shepherd is supposed to deal with gentleness and kindness towards his sheep. On the other hand, we read that the shepherds deal with them harshly and brutally. So what has happened to these sheep? I want us to note the fact that when Ezekiel is writing this, both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom have been defeated by enemy nations, and most of the people have been taken into exile. They have been taken into other nations. And look at what God says in verses 5 and 6. So they were scattered, the sheep were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. God is speaking to the shepherds of Israel, and he is saying that my sheep have been scattered all across these nations because no shepherd was giving them proper guidance. They have therefore now become food for wild animals. Therefore, God complains against these shepherds that they have not done what they were supposed to do. And therefore, God is very, very upset with these shepherds. And when we go further into this chapter, in verses 9 and 10, God declares his punishment on these bad shepherds. Ezekiel 34, 9 and 10. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. So God is complaining that the people of Israel, his sheep, have become food not just for the wild animals, the nations around them, but the sheep have also become food for the shepherds. And therefore he says that I'm going to remove you from tending the flock, and I'm going to hold you accountable for all that has happened to the sheep. And therefore now God goes on to present himself as the good shepherd for the sheep of Israel. And verses 11 through 16, God is going to mention all the things that he is going to do as the good shepherd for the people of Israel. Verses 11 onwards. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out of the nations and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines, and in all the settlements in the land. I will tend them in a good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. Then they will lie down in good grazing land, and then they will feed in rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. But the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. So God goes on in these verses to explain what a good shepherd is supposed to do and what he himself as the good shepherd is going to do for the people of Israel. And also in this chapter, when we come down to verses 23 and 24, God speaks of another shepherd that he is going to send among the people of Israel, who is also going to shepherd his people like a good shepherd. Look at verses 23 and 24. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. Mind you, when Ezekiel is writing these words, David has been dead and gone for hundreds of years. So who is Ezekiel talking about? Who is God talking about? God is speaking about the Messiah that would come as the son of David in the line of David, and he would be a good shepherd for the people of Israel. And so God is speaking about the Messiah as the good shepherd. And verse 24, I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be a prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. So God is speaking about his sending the Messiah as a good shepherd. And so when we come to the Gospel of John, chapter 10, when Jesus says that I am the good shepherd, first of all, he is equating himself with God. He is saying God is a good shepherd and I am a good shepherd too. In Psalm 23, David calls God as his shepherd, and now Jesus is introducing himself as the shepherd. And so number one, he is equating himself with God, and number two, he is also saying that I am the Messiah that God has promised in the Old Testament, because Ezekiel chapter 34 speaks about the good shepherd to come, and I am the good shepherd. Now with that, we bring to an end section 1, and we move to section 2, where we are going to turn our attention to the Gospel of John chapter 9, where we read of bad shepherds. We are talking about the Pharisees, who are examples of these bad shepherds. The Pharisees and the other Jewish religious leaders in this chapter are treating a sheep, a blind man, very, very harshly and very, very brutally. They are treating his parents with disrespect. They are trying to intimidate and threaten people into submission under their will. In fact, they are trying to keep all the people of Israel under their control. And we're going to look at that a little bit. We discussed the story when we were discussing Jesus' statement, I am the gate for the sheep. And the story also provides the background for Jesus' statement, I am the good shepherd. So in John chapter 9, we read of the story of a blind man who was born blind, and at the age of 40, he receives his eyesight through Jesus. And the story comes to the ears of the Pharisees, who are upset with Jesus because Jesus has performed this miracle on a Sabbath. So they have two things that they have against this man and against Jesus. Number one, they won't trust this man. They won't believe his story. They think that somehow there is falsehood involved. And number two, if at all this is a true story, they're upset with Jesus because he has performed this miracle on a Sabbath. And so instead of rejoicing with the sheep who was once blind and can now see, they are trying to find fault with this man. They're trying to find fault with Jesus, and they are using all their intimidation techniques in order to threaten this person. When you come to chapter 9, verse 17, we read like this, Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. And the man replied, he is a prophet. And so they want the blind man to somehow say that Jesus is a sinner because Jesus performed this miracle on him on a Sabbath. But this blind man is not someone to bend under pressure. He tells the Pharisees that I think that he is a prophet. When you come to verses 18 and 19, you would realize that these Pharisees, the bad shepherds, are not ready to believe in the story of this blind man who is now healed. Verse 18, they still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son? They asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see? And so they are questioning his parents now because they just don't believe that this blind man is telling the truth. And therefore we have his parents providing a very diplomatic kind of answer to the Pharisees. They say in verse 20, "We know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind, but how he can now see or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." Why this diplomatic kind of answer? Verse 22 tells us his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." The parents of the blind man are afraid of the Pharisees. Why are the sheep afraid of the shepherds? They're afraid because the shepherds are trying to keep them under their control and intimidating them, and by pushing anyone who would think anything positive about Jesus, they were going to push them out of the synagogue. And the blind man's parents did not want that kind of a thing to happen to them. They were afraid of being excommunicated by these shepherds, and therefore this kind of a diplomatic answer. Verses 24 and 25. "A second time, the Pharisees summoned the man who had been blind. 'Give glory to God by telling the truth,' they said. 'We know that this man is a sinner.'" So now there is no subtlety to their interrogation, to their questioning. They are saying, "Give glory to God, you, by telling the truth." And what is the truth? We know that this Jesus is a sinner. Now, this man again is confident, and he says, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." Now, these people, the Pharisees, listening to the responses of this blind man, is very, very furious with him. And when we come down to verse 28, "Then they hurled insults at him and said, 'You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses. But as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from.'" In other words, they are trying to put this blind man in a different group and themselves in a different group. "We belong to the people that belong to Moses. We believe in Moses, but you belong to Jesus. You belong to that community." And verses 34, they tell the blind man, "You are steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. In other words, they're very, very upset with this blind man because he is putting his faith and trust in Jesus. And they say, "You are steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out of the synagogue. The very thing that his parents were afraid of has happened to this blind man now. Instead of rejoicing with him, instead of celebrating with him, they have thrown him out of the synagogue. No wonder the Pharisees are bad shepherds. The Jewish religious leaders in this chapter are acting like bad shepherds. And that leads us to section number 3, where we are going to talk about Jesus Christ, the Good Shepherd. In verse 35, the Good Shepherd is seeking for this sheep that has just been excommunicated from the synagogue. Verse 35, "Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, 'Do you believe in the Son of Man?'" In other words, he looks for, he seeks after this lost sheep, this excommunicated sheep. And he comes to him and he says, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" In other words, Jesus is introducing himself to this blind man. And verses 36 to 38, this man asks, "Who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." And then the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. And so Jesus is now introducing himself to this blind man. And in the very next few verses, he is going to introduce himself as the gate through which people enter into the community of God. In other words, he's telling the blind man, even if you have been thrown out of the synagogue, I am the gate. I can receive you into the community of God. No one comes to the Father except through me. We discussed that in the previous video, so we are interested only in the statements that Jesus speaks about himself, where he announces himself as the good shepherd. Now, Jesus, in at least 3 places in chapter 10, is speaking about thieves and robbers. He describes the bad shepherds as thieves and robbers. Look at verse 1. He's speaking directly to the Pharisees. Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber." He is telling them that I am the gate. And if you are trying to get into the sheep pen by any other way other than me, you are a thief and you are a robber. When you come down to verse 8, Jesus speaks about all who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. He's referring to all the bad shepherds, including the Pharisees and the other Jewish religious leaders. He calls them as thieves and robbers, the bad shepherds. In verse 10, he speaks about the leader of all these bad shepherds. He's introducing Satan there as a thief and a robber. He says in verse 10, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. But I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." So the bad shepherd, the captain of all these bad shepherds, Satan himself, comes to kill, steal, and to destroy. And therefore all the other bad shepherds are doing the same thing to the sheep. But I have come that these sheep might have life, and they may have life to the abundant, to in all its fullness. So number 1, he calls these bad shepherds as thieves and robbers. Number 2, he calls them as strangers. In verse 5, he says, "But they," meaning the sheep, "will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice." So Jesus is probably referring to the blind man following Jesus and not following the Pharisees. And he says that the sheep will never follow a stranger. Bad shepherds are strangers. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. He also calls these bad shepherds as hired hands. Look at verses 12 and 13. "The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep." Again, he is talking about the Pharisees and the other religious leaders who did not care for the people of Israel, did not care for the sheep. They were like hired hands who, when they see the wolf coming, they run in order to protect their own lives. And so the bad shepherds, the Pharisees, are destroying the sheep of Israel, the people of God. In contrast to all of this, the good shepherd, verse 3, we are told that the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. In other words, the good shepherd knows every one of his sheep. They recognize his voice. He knows each of their names. He is able to lead them into good pastures and so on. Verse 4, "When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice." In other words, the good shepherd is a leader of his sheep. He leads them to the green pastures. He leads them to the still waters. The sheep recognize his voice. When you come to verse 10, the second part, we've already read that the good shepherd exists so that the sheep may have life. Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the fullness. In other words, the sheep are very, very happy. The sheep are full of life under a good shepherd. Verse 11. Further, one more characteristic about the good shepherd. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And so the good shepherd is not like the hired hand who runs away when he sees the wolf, but he is someone who will lay down his life for the sheep. Verse 14, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. And so there is an intimate relationship between the good shepherd and the sheep. And verse 15, he once again says, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And so Jesus is introducing certain characteristics of the bad shepherds, like the Pharisees and the religious leaders. And then he goes on to introduce some of the good characteristics of the good shepherd, and he's speaking of himself. And in this saying of Jesus, Jesus is speaking of himself as the perfect leader of God's people, as the perfect shepherd for God's people. All over the world, people are looking for good leaders. Every election time, people are looking for good leaders. But ultimately, there is only one good shepherd, and that's Jesus Christ. I invite all of us to follow this good shepherd. I believe these words were a blessing for you. God bless all of us. Thank you.